When the young students come up to me now to talk to me about a career in neurology, I don't steer them away from adult neurology. I steer them toward adult neurology because we need more people in the field of dementia.
Most people think of epilepsy, they think of seizures alone. But what about the causes, and if they run deep, tied to our metabolism, genetics, or even the way our bodies process vitamins? Well, today we are joined by the brilliant Dr. Phillip Pearl, Chief of Epilepsy and Clinical Neurophysiology at Boston Children's Hospital and Professor at Harvard Medical School. He is taking us on a journey through inherited metabolic epilepsies, from stories of vitamin B6 responsive epilepsy to the exciting world of genetics, diet, and even gene therapy. If you haven't done so already, please press the thumbs up in this episode, comment below, and subscribe to our channel so that we can get way more people around the world, clinicians, patients, and the general public, learning facts about the epilepsies.
I'm Dr. Phillip Pearl. I'm the Chief of Epilepsy and Clinical Neurophysiology at Boston Children's Hospital, and I run the Division of Epilepsy, which is composed of nearly 30, depending upon who you count, pediatric epileptologists. So it's a very large program.
What kind of keeps you going in this sphere? Because bad things happen, right? And when they happen with children, it can just, well, if it happens with adults, it's heartbreaking, but with kids especially, what keeps you going today?
On the one hand, it is difficult because these are ultra rare diseases. So you could spend your whole life. I mean, they say more people got their PhD on Tay-Sachs disease than actually had Tay-Sachs disease.
That's ridiculous.
It's a funny statement, but it actually means something. It's like you could spend your whole life studying a disease that affects so few people that you won't really make any impact. But the truth is, one, parents have become much more advocates in my career than they ever were before, right? It's not even close. So there's a lot of prodding and advocacy and pushing, and I don't mean pushing in a bad way, but in a constructive way, to make progress in these ultra rare diseases because it affects their kids. So that's like one thing. And the power of advocacy is pretty amazing. The next thing is, anything we learn about these diseases, we end up learning, in my view, fundamental things about the nervous system. That really excites the scientist in me. So the parents that I'm involved with, the advocates, that really excites like the clinician in me. And the implications for understanding the foundation of the brain, of neurology and neuropathology and physiology, that stimulates the scientist in me. And on a social level, I mean, these discoveries we're making in rare diseases are ultimately going to be applicable to much more prevalent diseases, and diseases that affect not just the newborn and the infant, the child, and the adolescent, but the adult. And quite frankly, the biggest scourge of our time with the aging of the population, people living longer, is dementia. Mm-hmm. When the young students come up to me now to talk to me about a career in neurology, I don't steer them away from adult neurology. I steer them toward adult neurology because we need more people in the field of dementia. And so as much as I think it's wonderful to go into pediatric neurology, which I did, why did I do it? I always wanted to be a pediatrician. I'll be totally honest. I mean, it's funny, when I was in the fifth grade I think fifth or fourth grade, I read this book called Stories of Great Physicians. And it was about Hippocrates and Madame Curie and Louis Pasteur and Sabin and Salk. And I just thought, and I love science and I love school actually at that point in my life. I was in fifth grade maybe. And I said, this is the best thing to be. I'm going to be a doctor. And my own pediatrician was a role model for me, which is interesting because the changes in demographics, people have to recognize role models are important, even for young children. I have to say, the following year, I read a book about great Supreme Court justices. And if I read that first, I might have gone into law school. Huh? So the young mind is very malleable. And then as I got older, I wanted to be a musician. And I do play music semi-professionally even now. And my dad was a professional musician, so that was an influence, both nature, nurture thing. It was all going on for me with that. But on the other hand, I worked like 7 straight summers as a camp counselor. I loved kids. So I wanted to be a pediatrician. Now, once I got into college, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and really couldn't afford to go to any fancy expensive place, but I ended up going to Johns Hopkins for undergraduate, which was
That's not so
pretty
bad.
sensational.
Yeah.
And I got inspired there by taking a course in medical ethics. And in that course, I was placed in the birth defects clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I was under the tutelage of a Dr. John Freeman, who at the time was the chief of pediatric neurology at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I was just mesmerized by the whole thing. So at that point, I pretty much fell in love with pediatric neurology. Although I was still undecided when I went to medical school, the most fascinating condition I ever encountered was schizophrenia, because how does a genetic condition do that to a person? We can have a young, bright person, and once they go to college, they completely fall apart with paranoia, hallucinations. And it's just, whether we call it psychiatric or not, it's clearly a degenerative disease.
Yep.
Which is where psychiatry and neurology are combined. The problem is when I did my psychiatry rotation in medical school, the last thing I wanted to be was a psychiatrist. It just wasn't for me, and that's a whole nother story. But I just wasn't that interested in a lot of what these people had to deal with. However, then I sort of rediscovered neurology because I did my neurology rotation in medical school and completely fell in love with the discipline and neuroscience. And I almost did adult neurology, but then I kept going back to my initial thing as a kid. I wanted to be a pediatrician, so I became a pediatric neurologist.
So what does the future hold for children and, well, potentially adults and metabolic epilepsies? I mean, you said that, genetics, neuroscience is taking us places. Are the lives of people going to improve? Do you think we will be able to control people's symptoms at a much earlier age and prevent cognitive regression and things like that?
Their lives are going to improve, but it's going to be a long, hard road. And we're all excited about these discoveries. But as a parent once observed in a meeting on Angelman syndrome, it's a good time to have Angelman syndrome for a mouse. In other words, you can go to a meeting after meeting and hear about the mouse model of this and the rat model of that. Like we're doing a mouse model of SSADH deficiency, which is the particular disease where I'm focused, which is a disorder of GABA metabolism. And everything's in the mouse or whatever animal. And we got a long way to go before a lot of this is going to be applicable to humans. Now, on the other hand, there's a disorder called AADC deficiency that you may have read about because I was involved in the clinical trial here. And now the gene therapy has been FDA approved, and it was approved by the EMA, European Medical Association, about 2 years ago or even more now. And there have been about 60 people now in the world who received this gene therapy, at least in the putamen. There's another entry mechanism into the substantia nigra. So there are two ways of placing it. But the point is it goes directly into the brain, into the parenchyma, the tissue of the brain. And it makes this huge difference for at least the young ones. We're not sure about the older ones. But there's even one adolescent patient who came off a tracheostomy because of the gene therapy. So we're treating all ages because it's been approved for all levels of severity in all ages. Basically, well, when I say all ages, from 18 months to 65 years. So basically all ages by the FDA.
Yeah.
Even though in the trial we only did non-ambulatory patients, we can even treat ambulatory patients. So there's all this excitement. That's the best example I have of lives improving dramatically. In fact, the most transformational, I would say, intervention in my career has been to treat this little girl from Thailand who came to us unable to hold her head up at age 2, and we did the therapy, and 9 months later she was walking. And I have videos, and her parents are very grateful, and it's been incredible. So for the individual case like that, it's transformational. For most people, this is all very incremental little increases. We have new therapies approved for, say, Rett syndrome, and there's gene therapy that's coming out. Gene therapy is available now, say, for MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy. We're working on gene therapy in one of our labs here under the guidance of my good friend and colleague, Dr. Alex Rotenberg, on SSADH deficiency, and his colleague, Dr. Henry Lee. And it looks like it's really good, but that's in the mouse. We got a long way to go before we get to the humans. Now, on the other side of this is the darker side, which is you and I were talking before the podcast about how epilepsy has its frightening aspects, and one of them is SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy patients. And we talk about it more now because we've learned, in fact, we're about to publish this, we've learned that families need to know it exists before it happens. That makes a huge difference in how they cope with the tragedy of it happening in their own family. Whether it's preventable or not is a little bit up for discussion. But it certainly is motivating for people to know about it and take their medicines more adherently and things like that. But the point I'm trying to make is the metabolic patients seem to be at higher risk for that. We know that certain genetic conditions like SCN1A, SCN8A, the sodium channelopathies, have a very high risk of SUDEP. It's also turning out to be true for the metabolic kids. And in fact, there's a wonderful meeting held every year with the American Epilepsy Society meeting called PAMI, Partners Against Mortality and Epilepsy.
Oh, yes, I know. Yeah, know the guys, yeah.
And my colleague, Dr. Etai Tokatli-Latzer from Tel Aviv, and I, although he was with Boston for 3 years working with me, we presented at last year's meeting in Los Angeles on SUDEP in the inherited metabolic epilepsies. In fact, we had one of the mothers of my patients with SSADH deficiency who she met me during the natural history study. They traveled all the way from Dubai to meet me. And I noticed the seizures were getting worse, so I let her know that SUDEP was a high risk in this condition. And she went home, and a few weeks later, she found her son dead in his bed. So she experienced SUDEP. And she said the only thing that got her through it was she heard me saying this can happen. And since then, she flew to California and gave a speech on it with all the parents there. And she's written a book on this now. So this is not a big secret. The point is we don't want it to be a secret. And when we're talking about conditions like this, not only are there other morbidities, as you asked me about, besides seizures, but there's increased risk of mortality.
It's brilliant that you've said that. Mortality, whether it's through the seizure itself, whether it's SUDEP, whether in some people it's suicide, there are many different things, right? For instance, suicide is much higher rate amongst people with an epilepsy, correct?
Absolutely. I have to say at the PAMI meeting, we heard as many stories about depression and suicide as we did about SUDEP. And depression is common in epilepsy, which frankly is understandable. And suicidality is a byproduct of depression. So the whole thing makes sense. And if people know this, then I think that can go a long way toward treating it.
Now, Philip, we're ending on a very positive note here. You are, as you mentioned briefly, a musician, but you are like a musician. And I believe that we're going to have an episode about the positive impacts of music upon people with an epilepsy. Is that right?
Well, there's a lot to talk about with music and epilepsy. We could talk about the Mozart effect and musicogenic seizures. The positive music therapy in epilepsy, that is going to be a controversial one, just like it is with autism. But it does seem to have definite improvement in dementia, Parkinson's, and some of those neurologic diseases. So there's a lot to cover when it comes to music in the brain.
Thank you to Philip for sharing his incredible knowledge on inherited metabolic epilepsies and helping us to understand how treatments have progressed from vitamins to today's cutting-edge therapies. Check out more about Philip at the website torierobinson.com, where you can access this podcast, the video and the transcription of the entire episode all in one place. And if you haven't done so already, please press the thumbs up for this episode, comment below, and do subscribe to our channel so that we can get way more people around the world, clinicians, patients, and the general public learning facts about the epilepsies. See you next week.